Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special show, we'll be talking debate prep for presidential candidates, the fallacy of national polling, Trump's legal travails, and a whole lot more. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio. We're very lucky to have with us Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner, who joins us to discuss the upcoming Kamala Harris-Donald Trump presidential debate. Thanks for being here, Tim.
Always a pleasure, Mark, of course.
So, Tim, I'm so looking forward to this debate. And 2 points I want to kind of put out there and then get your feedback on. It is, number one, the last person to debate Donald Trump ended up quitting his campaign. How do you think that's going to impact Kamala Harris's mindset going into the fight?
Not much, because the result of the first debate had almost nothing to do with Donald Trump, except for the fact that he did show a level of discipline in the debate that he had never shown before, but a lot of that was because his mic was muted. And it's certainly interesting that now, when Trump wanted the microphone live against Biden insisted on it being muted. Now, Trump wants it to be muted, and Harris wants it to be live. So, when they're not talking, so who really knows? But, the big interview with Kamala Harris, where she looked like she was at a closed coffee shop late in the evening, and she looked like she was about half the size of Tim Walz, and it looked like they hadn't cleaned up a bunch of dirty dishes that had been left behind. I don't know who thought of that tableau for Kamala Harris's first interview out of the box. But let's remember that as evasive as she was during that interview, that was 16 minutes, 16-minute interview, at least the parts that we saw. This is 90 minutes. And Kamala Harris won't have Tim Walz there to hold her hand. He won't be the dad at the job interview like he was with Dana Bash, who I thought did a...
Like Linus's security blanket.
Security
Charlie
blanket,
Brown, as
yes.
you wrote in your...
Yes, she won't have that, but I think that we can see clearly that Kamala Harris's strategy is to deflect, to basically confuse people with changes of policy and word salads so that she can't really be pinned down. There's no reason to think this will be any different. So I think in the end, what really matters here more than anything, strangely enough, is how Trump reacts in this debate, because he was, by all accounts, quite flummoxed that Joe Biden was no longer in the race, and then suddenly Kamala Harris is anointed to the top of the ticket, and she gets all this great publicity and the joy of the convention and all this stuff. So he frankly hasn't been, I think, entirely sure exactly how to go after Harris. And part of the problem, Mark, I think, is that there's so many possible lines of attack that you can't do all of them. So you have to decide where you think she is most vulnerable to the greatest number of voters. But I mean, it's such a target-rich environment. It will be curious to see what Trump emphasizes. Does he emphasize the economy? Does he emphasize crime, immigration, inflation? He will discuss all of those things, plus the foreign wars. But where does he think she's most vulnerable? I think, on the other hand, not to go on too long here, as I go on too long, I think it's pretty clear that Kamala Harris will try to do the same thing that Biden wanted to do but couldn't, which is to get under Trump's skin, to get into his head, to force him into bombast that makes him look like the bad Donald Trump instead of the good Donald Trump and the economy and all those kind of issues.
But it's interesting that she'd try that strategy. I can see why that could be appealing, because this whole debate is going to be cut down into miniature sound bites that will play out across social media.
Yes.
And that's where people will get the cut and thrust of the whole thing, because not that many people in the grand scheme of things will watch it from start to finish and make their own evaluations on it. Most people will, if they do watch the debates at all, be watching it on a network that will cut away and give like that little spin on things, or fact checking Donald Trump over everything. He'll say, I made a beautiful wall. And they'll say, the wall that he made was not in fact beautiful. We rate that as it was an ugly wall.
Yes. So when fact checkers start fact checking jokes,
I know,
we're in trouble.
Well,
and they're doing it.
Of course. I mean, it's since Donald Trump did that town hall where he said, I'd be a dictator on day one just to do this. It was clearly a joke. And yet this has become the lodestone, the guiding light, which the supposedly wise men of the media are marching towards him. Well, he said he'd be a dictator. He said it. When people tell you who they are, believe them, because apparently making a gag is not acceptable for Donald Trump. But let's talk about Kamala Harris a little bit. Yes, I think she will try, as you say, to bring out the bombast in Donald Trump, which, to be fair, a lot of people actually enjoyed in 2016, especially his riposte to Hillary Clinton. Well, that's because you'd be in jail.
Yes.
I mean, that's still making the rounds on the internet now. It was an iconic moment. But there's this pervasive idea that because of her career as a prosecutor, that she's hard-nosed, she's tough, she can handle the cut and thrust of debate. And in fact, the BBC website had this, it was like a 1,500-word essay on how incredible Kamala Harris is at debates. And there are 3 points that they made this argument with, was that she won a debate to become Attorney General of California against a Republican, which is clearly, there was no way that she was not going to win that. That she became senator after debating a Republican. Again, California, the Republican wasn't going to win.
It's what you call a one-party state.
Yeah. And then the third part, which they really glossed over, they said she actually had more speaking time than any other candidate during the 2020 election primaries, other than Joe Biden. But what they didn't mention is that after that debate, she was forced to close up shop and shut down her campaign without receiving a single delegate. Mm-hmm. And of course, receiving, as I believe, and I think I've still got this number correct, a mere 824 votes in the Democratic primary from the entire nation. And so this idea that she's a tough, hard battling prosecutor who can think on her feet, I don't buy it.
Well, we'll get a chance to see whether the country buys it. You can dodge and you can be clever up to a certain point. You can use word salads that sort of convey basic principles that everybody likes, like I support freedom. Okay. Well, the people that are anti-freedom are not exactly holding demonstrations saying we don't want freedom. See, she's using, comforting bromides is the way that I would put it. And she's going to try to make Donald Trump look mean and cruel and basically not having the character necessary to become president of the United States. Of course, the problem is that he was already president. So people can see what he would or wouldn't do. I think it's notable, Mark, to look at the lines of attack that the left has used. And it's not hard because they send out their talking points and then all of a sudden, every Democrat strategist And office holder goes on TV and uses the same talking point. Case in point, Exhibit A is the word weird. Okay, Tim Walz actually elevated his profile by describing Trump and Vance as weird. Okay, suddenly the next day on TV, there was about 10 different commentators that used the word weird. So my point is that they get their marching orders and they walk in lockstep based on the most recent talking points. And you might note that they've stopped really talking about saving democracy. They've stopped talking about January 6th. Now they're talking about Project 2025, which is not even a Trump policy. So it shows that the lines of attack on Trump are really limited to a general character attack, to that issue, and to abortion. And so you can expect that's what Kamala Harris will do, and she will act, I guarantee you, as she did with Mike Pence. 5 times she said, "Excuse me, I'm speaking, don't interrupt me." She's going to have that indignant attitude towards Trump, I guarantee you, where she's going to try to show that she's tough by telling him to shut up. I expect that to happen.
Yeah, it's almost as though she doesn't understand that it's a debate. Yeah,
right, where both people are actually supposed to talk. I don't know what's going to happen with the mic issue, but it'll be fascinating right down to the last minute before the debate starts.
We'll be covering that on the pages of libertynation.com. We'll be back with Tim Donner after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. We're continuing our conversation with longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Earlier we were talking about the debate angles and strategies that could be employed by either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. Now, I want to verge Tim onto something relative to the 2 presidential contenders, and that's the polling. Now, let me just set out what I've seen, what I've noticed at present is that Kamala Harris is leading in almost all national polls, and that anybody who's explaining the national polls is not pointing out that that's entirely irrelevant. Why do you think that is?
Why they're not relevant, or why they keep pointing them out?
The second one. The second one.
Because it fits their narrative that Kamala Harris is perfectly capable of being president, that she's doing better than Joe Biden. She's putting the pressure on Trump, and the best way to show that is to show national averages, which includes, I think, a lot of votes of frustrated Democrats who just couldn't get themselves to vote for Biden because he literally couldn't do the job. Yep. So I think this is a reflection of a lot of Democrats coming home to a candidate who's younger and more dynamic. Of course, that's not very hard to do when Joe Biden was the person you're replacing. But she's getting an incredible bump from the Democratic National Convention, from the relief that Biden isn't there anymore. And so what they've done is they've fabricated joy about someone who has never elicited joy in her entire political career. I mean, you think about it. Kamala Harris has elicited many responses over her career as a district attorney, attorney general, senator, and vice president, but likability has never been one of them, to say the least. So they have to try and say that that's always been overrated because the country didn't really know Kamala Harris. Well, now they will get to know her. And I think the hardest thing to do as a candidate is to try and pretend to a national audience that you're something that you're not. It doesn't work. So Kamala Harris is busy rehearsing, and I sense, Mark, she'll probably be very, very over-rehearsed for this debate. But to the issue of national polls, it shows you how little they matter, because the last 2 elections, because Trump was beaten in the popular vote handily in both 2016 and 2020. And in both cases, he came within 50,000 votes of winning. He actually won in 2016. And if about 50,000 votes had changed in 3 states in 2020, he would have won as well. That renders this national vote totally irrelevant. It comes down to the 7 swing states. It always has. Those are the ones that matter. That's where all the candidates are spending their time. That's where the election will be decided. So she and Tim Walz and J.D. Vance and Donald Trump will be spending all their time in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, and maybe Nevada, because that's where the election will be decided. And I think Trump still has a structural advantage in those states. He's still got more states in his column secure, I believe, at this point than Kamala Harris. But so much rests on this debate. I consider the polls at this point to be virtually irrelevant. But if you do want to read them, the best way to read the polls at this point is how I headlined my story on Labor Day. Dead heat on Labor Day. Where it goes from there, Michael Dukakis was ahead by 17 points and he lost by 8. Then again, in 2020, Donald Trump was behind by 7 points in May, and he pretty much stayed that way the rest of the race. So you have races that are stable and races that are not stable. This is clearly not a stable race, which makes it impossible to predict what will happen come November 5th.
I wonder if part of that is because Kamala Harris has only really been the candidate for, at time of recording, I think 45 days,
Yeah.
which is, we usually get a fairly firm sense at the beginning of the primary seasons about who's going to be the candidate. There's the breakaway candidate, or at least, for example, in the 2020 election, it was by the time South Carolina primaries came around, that was the defining moment for Joe Biden. But after that, it was pretty much assumed he's the candidate. And so there's months before you get to the Labor Day, which is the official start of
Right.
the season. Tim, one final question for you, if I may. As you say, it's all about the battleground states here. And for me, I think Pennsylvania is about to earn its reputation as the Keystone State. How do you think that's playing out for either candidate? Just very quickly on that, please.
Well, that race looks absolutely dead, even in Pennsylvania. Most of the polls reflect that. There's been a bump for Harris since Biden left the ticket. That was quite predictable. It's going to come down to turnout in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, whether the black vote really will turn out for her the way that Kamala Harris hopes. And then it's Erie County, which is probably the single most important county in the entire country because it's a bellwether. Whoever wins Erie County in Pennsylvania always wins the presidential election. So you'll be seeing an awful lot of time spent in a relatively small county in Pennsylvania called Erie County over the next several weeks.
The new official homes of candidates Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Tim Donner, thanks ever so much.
Pleasure, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
In the run-up to the election, it's going to be quite the month of September for former President Donald Trump as he faces numerous legal happenings. And we're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza, who has been following very, very closely the various hurdles and travails that the former president is facing. Thanks for being here, Scott.
Cheers, Mark. My pleasure.
So I guess what we really need first is a timeline of what's happening for Donald Trump in the multiple cases, but most specifically the one in which he's been found guilty.
Yeah, let's start with the one in his
counts.
The one that starts in his former home state of New York, and the state criminal charges which he was found guilty of, and he's challenging those charges on a number of fronts. And those are all kind of coming to a head now. On September the 16th, the trial judge, Merchan, who Trump has accused of being a kind of political actor, whose daughter has benefited directly from the case because she's some kind of Democrat Party consultant.
Only financially, though, is the accusation, I believe.
Just to put it out there, because it's often not reported in some other big box media outlets, Mark. Yeah. Curious. But in any case, and that doesn't mean that he, has acted in a biased manner, but if the appearance of bias when applied to a Supreme Court justice from a member of the progressive left, for instance, were the standard, then Merchan would not be able to be judged in this case. But he has said that on September the 16th, he will rule on Donald Trump's motion that the charges be thrown out because he was immune from prosecution as president of the United States. And of course, Merchan will have to use the new Supreme Court ruling that Trump got from his federal case that said that the president was immune from some things. And so we'll see how he applies it to this verdict. Now, that sentence, if he imposes it, and that's another part of the timeline, which is currently scheduled for September 18th. So if Merchan rules there's no immunity, that itself will certainly be appealed by Donald Trump, but he'd rather not have to appeal. He's asking Judge Merchan to hold in abeyance his ruling until it goes to federal court, which is the sort of third leg thing in this case. So Donald Trump has a ruling set to come down the pike on the 16th by the judge on his immunity request or motion. Then on the 18th, if that request is anything other than just denied, he's scheduled to be sentenced on the 18th. Now that could be postponed, but that's the current schedule. And I will say this, that people are not, the New York lawyers that really know this stuff are not expecting a custodial sentence. So we don't think that he's going to go to jail. But then the third leg is, Mark, will Donald Trump be able to move the case to federal court? His last petition to do so was denied, not because of a lack of merit, but for lack of a procedural part, which was that they kind of had to get a sign off from the prosecutor or the judge. So that's where things stand.
Right. So let's game this out as it works. So 16th of September, as far as we know now, Judge Merchan or Justice Merchan, right?
Well, I didn't say it that way because there's a peculiar notion of state law where in New York and only New York in the United States, the what's called the Court of General Jurisdiction, or what folks might call the lowest basic trial court level, they are called justices and not judges like they are, I think, in every other state except maybe Louisiana. And you always have to wonder about Louisiana because they follow some Napoleonic code traditions, and it's all wacky. So
okay, so let's stick with Judge for now. So Judge Merchan, he's got a choice before him, and that is whether to take what the Supreme Court said and apply his prior ruling that found Donald Trump guilty of 34 felonies.
No, it was a jury, I think.
Sorry, the jury found Donald Trump guilty in his court. But whether to apply what was ruled or what was decided through the lens of the Supreme Court ruling that said that for official acts, Donald Trump has immunity.
They said a president is immune.
Sorry, a president
from official acts, right? Yes. But they didn't weigh in on whether Donald Trump was immune. They just said that a president is immune. And now you lower courts, they were talking to the federal district court that case came from. Now you figure out, was Donald Trump immune? Applying this new ruling.
It seems to me, Scott, that part of the reasons why Judge Merchan might do something other than just say denied, 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 go ahead. We're going ahead for the September 18th sentencing. It is that the evidence introduced during the trial that was presented to the jury by the prosecutors, many of those elements of evidence now seem to be, according to the Supreme Court, things that were carried out during the course of his duties and therefore shouldn't have been admissible, or have I got this wrong? And therefore the verdict was decided on inadmissible evidence. Is that about right? Or have I watched too much Annie
No,
McBeal
no, no.
recently?
I think that the arguments that you are making are arguments that Donald Trump's counsel will be making or are making to Judge Merchant, and also those are arguments that might be persuasive to an appeals court. Now, of course, for Donald Trump, because of this looming presidential election, he's looking to
I'd
get
forgotten
this.
about that.
I mean, in most criminal cases, time is not considered to be of the essence with these sorts of questions. It's like, well, the appeals court will sort it out, and we'll get an answer from them, and then perhaps even further challenge to the Supreme Court. But this case is a little different. One thing that I think should also be said all the time is the decision to prosecute itself is a political decision. It's not like in any case it's a political decision. In other words, even in a case where almost everybody from any ideological perspective would agree that it's a proper and just prosecution.
Like taking your tags off the mattress, yes. Something like that. Or murder, two things
Anything.
equivalent. Yeah.
But the point is what the society prioritizes. That's why we have elected prosecutors in the United States of America, is that this is supposed to reflect the will of the people in terms of where our prosecutorial priorities are. So if the community is beset with gang violence, for instance, you'd expect that to be prosecuted more than something else. And I just think it's important to make that case known to people. And also, this was an especially political prosecution because previous district attorneys, before Alvin Bragg became the district attorney, who was elected on a promise to go after Trump, by the way, but when Vance was the previous occupant of that office, he wanted to go after Trump.
That's Cy Vance Jr. rather than J.D. Vance, vice president.
Oh, yeah. Candidate. I guess you have to specify these days. Sorry. But he said he couldn't do it. He said the facts weren't there to impute criminality to Donald Trump. And he looked at it, I think, twice. And then it was only after this hotshot lawyer who's like this major anti-Trump lawyer who's worked at the Department of Justice, the Manhattan DA. I think he consulted with Fannie Willis in Georgia. He's like a one-man wrecking crew for Trump, kind of convinced, I guess, Bragg that they had a colorable case that they could make. And yeah, it's all political in that sense.
So Donald Trump will certainly appeal if Judge Merchan decides to go ahead with the sentencing. That will, by its nature,
he's already going to appeal anyway.
Yes.
That's just going to be a part of the appeal, I can tell you. Yeah.
So if it does go ahead to the 18th, where I believe it's scheduled for now that a sentence will be handed down. Now let's talk about that. In fact, we're going to talk about the sentencing of Donald Trump and what that might mean, if indeed it happens, after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're continuing our conversation with Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Mr. Scott Cosenza. Now, earlier in the show, we've just been talking about the potential avenues that Judge Merchan in the Donald Trump 34 felony cases might take on September 16th. Will he allow the case to go forward to sentencing, or will he veer off down some different path? But let's assume for now, Scott, that he doesn't say...
By the way, just because you didn't say it, to me, it's the dividing line. This is the New York State criminal case against Trump rather than one of the federal. Or
one of the many others that are in
right.
existence or waiting in the wings, no doubt. So let's assume that Judge Merchan says, Donald, because I'm sure he calls him by his first name, Donald, we're going ahead with the sentencing. So what is that going to look like? Let's start with the very basics. Is it likely that Donald Trump will be in New York, Manhattan courtroom at that time?
Oh, yes, he definitely will be. Merchan has required his presence in the court. And if he were to be sentenced to custody, which is an option, which is an option, a possibility, and I don't want to oversell it. I know we're going to talk about it more in depth. As you might imagine, it's a lot easier to take a person into custody for sentencing when they're in the courtroom rather than another jurisdiction entirely. So
I believe Dog the Bounty Hunter has Trump on speed dial anyway, so
yeah.
it shouldn't be too much of an issue there. So let's say Donald Trump's in the courtroom as per request. Obviously, there'll be a huge media.
No, you think there's going to be interest?
There'll be a huge media
You
pool
think?
outside in which I suspect Donald Trump will speak before he goes in, and
Uh-huh.
when he comes out, if he's allowed out, of course, that's one small option, of course. And so he'll be making political hay while that sun shines. But let's talk about now what could happen. What are the options here? You mentioned earlier in the show, Scott, that serious New York lawyers have intimated that this kind of crime would not carry a custodial sentence. Now,
Intimated is one way to put it. Another way to put it is they say, and I've read multiple discussions about this by New York criminal practitioners, and what they say is for a person that does not have a prior criminal conviction, the likelihood that on these facts, on this kind of charge, and it's not, there's no direct analogous kind of thing that you can talk about because of who he is and what happened.
And let's point out that the actual felonies of which he's been convicted are a novel application as well.
These are novel applications of a paperwork law and that law says if you file incorrect paperwork, that it's a felony because it's fraud on the public or something like that, who has a right to know. This was the mislabeling of the Stormy Daniels hush money payoff. So glad I got to use that hopefully one last time before those stories go away. But so instead of saying, hey, this was a payoff to silence this woman who was making these accusations, they said it was, well, now I forget what, maybe it said like consulting fees or something like that, but it doesn't matter. It was just not true, not strictly true. However, Mark, there was no accounting trick that somehow, it wasn't like they moved it from a non-tax deductible expense to a tax deductible expense or some other financial shenanigans or people who shouldn't have had to pay out for this. Like, it wasn't like Donald Trump's business partners had to pay, and he didn't do anything else except for, again, this was all to conceal the nature of this payout. And so that's why I think for a lot of us, it just seems like it's absolutely political and driven not by a search for justice or an application of facts to the law, but in an effort to get Donald Trump wherever possible.
Okay, so let's get to the questions that everybody, I guess everybody wants to know is, what are the likely sentences here? And I think, obviously, we can't speculate too much because, as you say, there's nothing analogous to this that's ever really happened.
The only thing
can I put together a small rubric and let's maybe discuss that? So let's start with the top end of the rubric. The most unlikely, I guess, is that Donald Trump is taken away to Rikers Island, him and his Secret Service team, and he has to serve a custodial sentence behind bars in the jumpsuit. That's the highly unlikely one.
If Judge Merchan is the 100% political actor that some think him to be, yeah, that's I really doubt that. There were many opportunities for the judge to lock Donald Trump up for contempt for violating certain orders that he imposed. And again, Judge Merchan did not do the most over-the-top anti-Trump thing possible in the moment during the trial.
Sure.
So he has a record of not going to the wall or to the mats, at every potential moment, to kind of get Trump.
Okay.
That's just, yeah. And by the way, and I was going to say that that's about the only thing I'm comfortable saying, in terms of predictions or whatever. It is just, I'm pretty confident Donald Trump is not going to be remanded to custody. Beyond that, what in terms of did you want to cut in?
Yes, please. So that means that the most likely scenario, and I think this is where everybody, based on my reading as well from, as you say, like New York criminal practitioners. I love that term, by the way, criminal practitioners. I practice crime. It's a great
like
phrase.
The Saul Goodman line, right? You need a criminal lawyer.
Yes, you need a criminal lawyer. So there'll be some kind of punishment. Now, if it's not custodial, then that would perhaps go into the realms of financial penalties.
Money, absolutely, yeah. Money, restrictions on movement, confined to Trump Tower with a monitoring bracelet, having to call in, picking up trash along the highway. These are all sorts of things that a criminal defendant in the United States might face who doesn't have to be incarcerated, but has other impositions on their liberty.
Okay, so...
And also, by the way,
yeah.
I think I'm not licensed to practice law in New York State, and a lot of different rules are state by state. So but in many states, a judge could impose a criminal sentence and then delay or stay its implementation. So the judge might say, I sentence you to X, Y, or Z, and I'm going to stay the implementation of that sentence unless and until the federal courts, if your case hasn't been seen by a federal court by January 1, 2025, for instance, just some sort of thing like that. This is another, as long as we're speculating as to what might be done, that is also something that might be done.
Okay, yeah, that's actually pretty much what I figured. It'd be suspended until such time as appeals are dealt with, dismissed, or accepted. Now, How does this impact Donald Trump's ability to campaign? Because it seems to me that you mentioned that they're confined to Trump Tower with an ankle bracelet. We don't think that's going to happen because that would be seen as an impediment towards his run for the presidency.
And let me I just want to add one little point to that. If it is something like that, like let's just say, use that as an example, he's confined to Trump Tower with an ankle bracelet, they will be in federal court with an emergency petition that day, I would imagine. They probably have it already written, ready to go with some fill in the blanks. And I would expect a federal court to say, let's hold off on the implementation of this sentence until, second, third week in November here, at least. So that's
certainly
something
not November 5th, right?
That's something that I would, it's baked into the cake that will, whether that court will grant it, I think they probably would, but they will certainly run to the appeals courts with anything that significantly impedes his ability to campaign for president.
Okay, and final question for you, Scott, just a very brief one, if I may. And this is not a legal question as such, but maybe you are a political watcher, so I do want your take on this. Is there any scenario where whatever happens on the 18th is damaging to Donald Trump among his base?
No, not among his base, but that's important, I think, as I am taught about the political goings on, and I have to accept the reality. It's swing state voters in swing states who will choose the next president of the United States, and not me or anybody else who doesn't live in a swing state and is a swing state voter within that state, Mark. But it seems to me like your average person who's not tuned in to see a person who's been criminally convicted is generally a negative around that person's, reputation and character. So,
Scott Cosenza, thanks ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guest today, longtime host of this here radio show, Tim Donner, and Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza. And of course, extend my thanks to you, the listeners, for tuning in each and every week. You are appreciated.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.